We've always been told from day one, since our very first day of school, that the Earth is a globe and Antarctica is just this small little icy continent at the bottom of a globe. We're even shown a globe in the middle of the classroom that illustrates Antarctica as this small little ice continent. And we're told that there's been many polar explorers all the way back to the days of the Ernest Shackleton and Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott days of exploration that have all explored Antarctica. And then we are also told that explorers from the likes of the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic expeditions, such as Vivian Fuchs and Edmund Hillary, have also explored and crossed Antarctica. We're told that explorers like Borg Ausland and Colin O'Brady and Mike Horn, that they've all made these traverses and these crossings of Antarctica. Is that really true? Are we actually being told what they're actually navigating and where they're going in Antarctica? Today we're going to do a deep dive into all of these alleged traverses and crossings of Antarctica, and we're going to take a closer look and find out that that's simply not the case. And we're going to find out that a lot of these explorations are being manipulated, and they're using things such as magnetic declination and specific starting points and end points of these expedition routes. They're also using arbitrary South Pole locations, which I had explained previously in a couple other videos. They're also using graded and flagged and marked expedition routes that they follow. And these routes are all planned, and you'll find out that a lot of these polar explorers all take this same exact expedition route, and that's for a lot of different reasons. We're also going to look at some of the lies and deception that some of these explorers have told, and from their starting points and where they actually navigated. We're also going to look at even the katabatic winds that a lot of these explorers use to navigate with kite skiing, how these katabatic winds actually disprove the globe model, and actually are very strong evidence that demonstrate a flat earth model in Antarctica. And we're going to basically look at some of these old historic explorations of Antarctica and compare them to some of the new ones, and we're going to see that logistically they're next to impossible, and they just do not work. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and take a look at this Colin O'Brady exploration first, and we're going to find out that it's not actually what we're told it is, and we're going to look at a lot of the discrepancies, and then we're going to start looking at some of these other Antarctica explorations.
Let's move on to the other recognizable local name, Colin O'Brady. You know this guy, right? I mean, he was on KGW like a million times. We did a bunch of stories about him. He's a Portland guy. He's an adventurer. He made a huge name for himself nationally and internationally in 2018 when he crossed Antarctica. He called it the first ever solo, unsupported, unassisted crossing of the continent. Then he wrote a book about it called The Impossible First, and he did a whole lot of press afterward, even with us here at KGW, where he talked about a lot of things, all of his amazing accomplishments, like summiting the tallest peaks in every state, finishing with Mount Hood.
Summit of Oregon! I freaking did it! And, that was incredible. That was so much fun to set this world record and to be able to finish it actually, here in my local community. So many people came out and supported the finish of that up at Timberline Lodge. We had a big, celebration up there.
So kind of a funny story. We were actually supposed to have Colin O'Brady in the studio today for Tonight with Cassidy. But then we saw this. National Geographic published this massive investigation questioning O'Brady's story. The article says that O'Brady embellished his journey across the Antarctic. Now, in his book, O'Brady wrote that at times there was no way of contacting people for help. The article claims that wasn't true. O'Brady also boasted he crossed the entire continent, when in fact he crossed kind of a narrow section of it, far smaller than stretches previously crossed by other adventurers. In short, we got tonight's quote of the day by famous writer-adventurer John Krakauer, quoted in the article saying O'Brady needs to be called out for his false claims. Now, we interviewed the author of that Nat Geo article today, and he stands by every word of it.
I've spent a couple months on it. I've interviewed dozens of people, including many of the world's top polar experts. And it's raised a lot of questions about the claims that Colin is making about what he achieved in Antarctica.
So back to kind of what we were saying before, how he was supposed to be here, Colin O'Brady, in the studio today. But then we saw the article. Then we wanted to talk about that instead. So he decided to postpone, which I do completely understand. He wants to get his ducks in a row. He did put a statement out on Instagram. He says that he, quote, stands by every word in my book. But we certainly hope to get a chance to talk to him in person soon.
Hey guys, Pat Shank here. This is a video response to Simon Dan's comment on my last video claiming that the path Colin O'Brady took in Antarctica is impossible to plot on the flat Earth. Well, I guess since he didn't comment on my laser gyro video, that means he can't debunk it. But anyways, so the first step is to find Colin's path. Then figure out the longitudes and latitudes. Now that I have the coordinates, I can use this website to find the locations on the Mercator map. Now the reason I want to do that is because I can make any Earth projection using the Mercator map. So first, I made a sphere, and looks like it's pretty accurate. So now let's take a look at what it looks like on the flat Earth. Now does that look like it debunks flat Earth to you? Not really, huh? Well, so final thoughts, guys. I mean, obviously this doesn't prove the globe. So I'm thinking the whole thing's probably bullshit, but I guess you guys be the judge.
Standing down there holding everyone up on my shoulders. It's funny you say about the flat earthers, though, because all jokes aside, I've been getting a lot of trolling on my Instagram page from the flat earthers. I've got to the edge. At least I didn't see the edge, and the curvature kept going, and I made it to the other side.
One of the things I wanted to briefly correct on that last segment was they had the globe to flat projection, transformation correct, but they didn't have the ending of the expedition, like latitude and longitude location, correct. At least it appeared it wasn't. Now, he actually finished this expedition at the foot of the Leverett Glacier at the very beginning of the inlet of the Ross Ice Shelf, which when we look at the Leverett Glacier, it's actually it's like 85 degrees south by 147 degrees west. It's like a 50-mile long, 3 to 4 mile wide glacier. So that's that general area where he finished. So if we actually plot that onto a flat map, we can see that he started at Ronnie Ice Shelf and went to the South Pole, and then he went through this unclaimed land territory of Antarctica, which you'll notice that's where all of these expeditions go through, like 99% of them. And I'm going to get into more detail on this later and how this is kind of part of the deception. But you can see he finished here at 147 degrees and 82 degrees south. Now, obviously, that's a lot shorter route than what was shown previously. And I actually, when we get into more into this, I believe this is actually, he didn't even navigate that far. It's probably even shorter than that. There's a lot of discrepancies we're going to come across here. But another thing that they do with these expeditions to Antarctica One of the ways that they manipulate the distances, locations, the starting points, endpoints is magnetic declination. And when I say that, basically what I'm referring to is, for one, we can't independently explore Antarctica. Like, we can't just freely go down there and pick and choose where we want to go to, per the Antarctica Treaty Handbook. Now, with that being said, like hypothetically, if we were able to, if you were to try to dead reckon from, let's say, Cape Town, Africa to, one of these base stations like New Meyer Station or Halley or Novo Station, which is the station that a lot of these expeditions start at, you couldn't just dead reckon straight there and get to that, whatever that, wherever it's claiming to be at, and that's where it's going to be, because there's going to be east and west magnetic declination, as well as north and south. So, you may think you're going to 140 degrees east, and it's actually, it's closer to like 120 or 115 degrees east. We have no way of independently verifying these locations of these base stations. And like when we look, for example, of where he started at the Ronnie Ice Shelf, and he navigated through to the foot of the Ross Ice Shelf. Now, if we look right where he was at the Leverett Glacier, there's already 105 degrees of magnetic declination, positive for the east. So, and you can get down to like the South Pole, and it's almost 180 degrees in certain areas. And, even over here, you got 162 degrees, by the Ross Ice Shelf. So when you get over to like by McMurdo Station and those areas in the Ross Ice Shelf, you have a drastic amount of magnetic declination that's telling you to go east or west. And, those stations aren't even remotely close to where they're saying they are, because they're having to make these corrections to arbitrarily place these locations to make the geography of these locations work with the actual geography landmass of Antarctica. So, and another thing too is, I think with a lot of these interior base stations, I think that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that they're arbitrarily located, like they're not where they say they are. And there's a lot of graded and flagged routes that they take between the outside coastal base stations to these interior ones. So you wouldn't really have to use GPS to get there. They're all flagged, and they have graded roads. I'm actually going to get into one of them specifically with the Colin O'Brady expedition here in a minute. But with that being said, there's these interior locations of these base stations like Concordia and Bostock, like they're basically located strategically to be in a certain region of different base stations to get to those locations relative to the South Pole. So like we can look at, even with some of these South Poles, there's, I believe there's actually arbitrarily located South Poles, because when you look at the, like I covered this before with the Our Fantastic Planet, but he went to the South Pole twice, and like the first photo he had taken at the South Pole, it showed all of the scenery, the scientific dome, and then the Amundsen Scott Station would be over here, a very large building. You see all these wood signs between the regular country signs here, continental signs, or the flags. And so you see all this scenery and background scenery here, and then you go to the second time he was there, like it was 2 or 3 days later, when he backtracked to go back there from Casey Station. And you'll notice that the scenery is completely missing from the what we're looking at here on the South Pole. All the scenery is missing in the background. You don't see that same scientific dome. You don't see the Amundsen Scott Station. You don't see those wood signs Like those would be pretty obvious. You would see those, and this is like a 180-degree perspective, you know, of what he's looking at. So it's almost a 360 panoramic view. Obviously, there's nothing behind him or the sides of him. And then not only that, but the pole is painted differently. The top stripe. Obviously, we're looking at it from the other side now, but even then, like this diagonal here would be the same height on this side here. And then the top, this second stripe from the bottom is like almost a foot taller than what it would be. It'd have to be this one here, because it can't be this one, because this one would be 7 to 8 inches in the snow. So whether or not they had a bad winter storm and they got a lot of snow, who knows? But that wouldn't change the fact that this top stripe is different. And I don't think they would get a foot of snow in just a matter of a few days. Plus, the snow is all compacted down, like there's a lot of foot traffic. So a lot of evidence that it's the whole different South Pole. There's no scenery in the background. It's completely empty. It's like he's in the middle of nowhere. It's a different painted pole. And then there's also an article in there in the book that says that none of the quote unquote Americans from the Amundsen Scott station would actually meet him when he got there. Like he's literally right outside the base station and there's nobody there. Like like nobody would come out there to refuel his plane. They wouldn't let him come in to rest. There's no human interaction the whole time he was there. And the reason why I believe on that second trip, he didn't see anybody and he was at a different South Pole. And the reason for that is because he's up here. So he's, if he's trying to go south to the South Pole, quote unquote, South Pole again from the other side of the world, he can't go to the actual Amundsen Scott that's down here at the other quote unquote South Pole. So they have an arbitrarily located South Pole up here. And to me, that's pretty, objective, conclusive evidence that that's the case. I mean, it's a whole different South Pole, and there's literally no scenery around them in a 360-degree view, and there's no other humans there. There's no other people there. So there's a lot of evidence that there's arbitrary locations of not just the base stations, but even the poles. And then you have this unclaimed land territory, and with that's even more suspicious, because when we look into the history of that. Like all the way back to the days of the Antarctica Treaty, they said that this region of West Antarctica, it was off limits to any countries. Nobody could put any base stations there. They couldn't put any kind of nobody could have any kind of ownership in that area of Antarctica. And the history of it's even kind of suspicious when you look into it. They call it Marie Birdland, which is the title given by Admiral Byrd. But it's, when you even look at it, it's not really like, there's really no legitimate reason why it's off limits. Like nobody can inhabit it. They can't put base stations there. They won't give any reason as to why. The whole thing is just mysterious. But when you actually look into it, like from the overall scheme of things, with all the other manipulation they're doing with these base station locations, it actually makes a lot of sense, because if Antarctica was truly a lot larger than we're told it is, and it's wrapping around the outside, surrounding the Earth, and you try to condense it into this small little ice continent at the bottom, you'd have way too much land mass to condense in this little small continent. And, when you're trying to place your base stations around it, you'd have too much land mass. So, once you have too many base stations that are close to each other all the way around, once you start flying out or flying into these base stations from these other land masses, the continents, you're going to start noticing the distances aren't matching up relative from where you're flying in from. That's why there's very limited areas to fly from. You can fly out of Cape Town. Then there's the McMurdo one. They fly from a lot of the scientific research flies out of I believe it was California to New Zealand, and then New Zealand to McMurdo. And then obviously the South Pole expeditions, they can only go from Punta Arenas down to the South Pole. But they don't ever take any South Pole expeditions from Australia or New Zealand up to Casey Station or Mawson Station and then to the South Pole. It doesn't exist. There's no tourism up there. There's no South Pole expedition tourism because they can't do it. You can't, because the actual South Pole that they travel to is on the other side of the world. It goes back to that arbitrarily located South Pole I was talking about earlier. So, with that being said, if you had all this extra land mass, what you would have to do is you would have to remove a slice of the pie of all this spherical excess. You'd have to cut that out, and you'd have to remove all that extra land because you have too much extra land to fit all the way around in this little ice continent. And that's where they implement this unclaimed land here. I believe that these distances, and I'm going to actually show you a flight that goes from Cape Town for these Antarctica expeditions, a flight that goes from Cape Town to Novo Runway, and it's like over 6 hours long that I found in a document from the Rune Geldis expedition. And it puts it, Novo Station way down here. It couldn't be like right up here like they say it is. It'd have to be, because that would only be like a couple, hour and a half, 2 hour flight. So with the jet streams and everything, it'd have to be way down here, like close to South Pole. And I think we're gonna get more detail on that. But when you look at all the distances between these Antarctica base stations and the flights and the way it's laid out, and then you throw in this unclaimed land territory, this whole slice of land that's taken out of Antarctica, then it all kind of starts to make sense how they're manipulating these distances. So, in like I was saying with Colin O'Brady, they actually said that there is a flagged, graded route. It's a road that goes through here, this unclaimed land. So obviously that's going to make it much easier to navigate through there, especially if you're kite skiing, which a lot of these explorers do. They're going to be able to travel a lot farther at greater distances if you have a smooth graded road. And this is actually something that he kind of left out of his book, Colin O'Brady. So, he had actually mentioned in his that at one point the winds, there was these extreme winds that took him off course, and it took him into like an area that he wouldn't be able to be like rescued. And because of that, he was in this off the map area. But then they found out later that the area that he was actually in, he was in fact on a graded and flagged vehicle route used frequently by a wealthy tourist, where he called from his satellite phone would, summon a rescue by ski-equipped twin otter planes within hours. So he there's a lot of stuff that he lied about in his book, and actually National Geographic were trying to contact him for interviews multiple times, like following up with this. And there's other polar explorers, experienced polar explorers. They're all trying to follow him up with these inquiries on the discrepancies with his distance and his where he started and stopped, and then where he actually was. And he like refused to do these interviews. He basically said he wanted to stop doing interviews. So there's a lot of right off the bat, this expedition is just it's a mess. A lot of dishonesty. There's a lot of discrepancies. And a lot of the polar explorers don't really consider it a legitimate expedition. So yeah, that's with the Colin O'Brady one. Now we're going to actually get into more details on some of these other expeditions, but I kind of want to lay the groundwork and infrastructure of how they pull this deception off with the the magnetic declination and the unclaimed land, um, the uh, the arbitrary locations of the base stations. Um, there's also corrections with the GPS, distance corrections. There's a lot of there's graded roads that they use that they don't really tell you about. There's actually a graded road. There's many of them that go from uh, the exterior coastal base stations to the interior ones. So there's a lot that they're not really telling you about to manipulate these expeditions. So we'll go ahead and get into more details on this Rune Geldis and Mike Horn expedition and kind of show you some of the deception that was going on with those expeditions. Now, I had previously done a pretty extensive debunk video on this Mike Horn expedition from 2017, but we'll kind of go over some brief details on it. Obviously, you can see the route he took from Novo Station to the South Pole and then Dumont D'Urville. Now, this expedition had a lot of discrepancies and time frame and mileage discrepancies. A lot of information missing of when he actually got to the South Pole. Contrary articles saying he got there weeks earlier than he was supposed to. And I think that's all for a specific reason. That first leg is always much shorter than the second leg when they go through that unclaimed land territory in Antarctica. So there's a lot of stuff that didn't add up with this, as well as when he finished the route in Dumont D'Urville, there's no real time timestamp photos of when he was there on his social media. So a lot of stuff missing, but let's go ahead and look at the route that he took on a flat AE map and see exactly the route he took. We can see this is the route that Mike Horn took on this rendered drawing, which is on a regular polar projection. You can see he started up at Novo Station and navigated to the South Pole and then down to Dumont D'Urville. Now, if we transfer that onto a flat AE map, we get something like this. He would have started at about Novo Station here, and he would have navigated the South Pole, and then he would have went through this unclaimed land territory, as I had mentioned earlier, and then he would go up to Dumont D'Urville. Now, this is where, again, this is, I believe they're using this. They're cutting a large area of landmass out of this region of Antarctica, and this is, like I said, this could be thousands, if not several thousands of miles that are missing, and they're basically just orienting the base stations closer to Africa and to Australia. They're changing the orientation of them with magnetic declination to drastically shorten this distance with this unclaimed land territory. Now, typically when you plot these out, these base stations, some of these stations are a little bit farther east or west, and the reason that these were shifted a little bit was because of the flight that I found out that from Cape Town to Novo Station was a little bit over 6 hours from this article on Rune Geldnis's expedition, which he basically took the same route as Mike Horn, except for the end. But they were saying that the flight from Cape Town to Novo Station is a little over 6 hours. And, when you look at that flight, and we've done a lot of research on the southern flights from like Sydney to Santiago, and I think that one's usually from like 12 hours and 20 minutes to 12 hours and 40 minutes. And so we'll just say it's a little over 12 hours. So if we cut that in half, the halfway point, that's about a little over, it's almost 7,100 miles. So that would put this at about 3,500 miles. And, and that's not even including the jet streams, which we know at this point that they do fly in those jet streams because we caught them lying about that on the Flight Radar 24 websites. So if we throw in that extra, 200, 300 miles per hour on those jet streams, that could be 4,500 to 5,000 miles on this flight that they're doing. And they use an IL-76 flight, which has a top or airplane which has a top speed of like 585 miles per hour, almost 600 miles per hour. But then you throw the jet streams in, it's going to be going much faster than that. So it wouldn't make sense that they're just flying here. Obviously, it's going to be much farther. If you take the halfway point from that Sydney to Santiago flight and you convert that over to here, it's going to be much farther down. It's like 4.5 latitude lines down, so it's going to be in this general vicinity. So with the jet streams, so we know that they're obviously with the magnetic declination, they're shifting these base stations to much different locations than what we're told they are. Just by looking at the flight times, they're just not working with what they're saying, with where they're supposed to be located. So we can kind of see that, and then we throw in the unclaimed land. They're obviously this navigation, this route is going to be much shorter in reality than what we're told it is. Another thing I wanted to point out was with the Rune Geldness navigation, he took basically the same route, and he took, instead of going to Dumont Nervais like Mike Horn did, he kind of wrapped around these transatlantic mountains, and he went back to over here by the Ross Ice Shelf. But they both started at Novo Station and went down to here. Mike Horn continued down here. Now the thing is, that's kind of suspicious about this Rune Geldness expedition is that he had taken 90 days to do it, and he had navigated about 4,800 kilometers, which is about 2,900 miles, whereas Mike Horn did it in 57 days, and he navigated about 3,100 miles. So he navigated about 200 miles further, and he did it in like 32 days, 33 days less for going 200 miles further. And they both kite skied. And if you actually go down the list, there's a lot of days that Rune Geldness is going over 200 kilometers per day. A lot of his mileage is similar to Mike Horn's, but yet he took almost twice as long to take almost the same exact route. So that's just really suspicious. It's another thing where, are they taking the exact same route once they get past the South Pole and that unclaimed land territory? Like, to me, that just kind of shows that once you get past the South Pole, things start to get a little distorted. Things get, directions and orientation and distances are much more distorted, because they're taking the same route on a polar projection, but once they get to here, there's many days, 50 days of time that are just missing or extra. So we're actually going to see with some of these other old historic navigations that it gets even more distorted with those distances in that region. But the other thing too with Mike Horn is when we look at the distance he navigated, we can look at the speed he was actually navigating while he was kite skiing, and he was going much faster than what we're told he was actually navigating. And just to kind of give you an example of how fast they're actually navigating before I get into Mike Horn's speed that he was navigating, we can look at this Rune Geldness navigation, and he makes a claim in one of his logs here that he was kiting in 25 to 30 kilometers per hour in the Strstrugi. So even like the rough terrain areas that would, typically would kind of slow you down a little bit, they're still going like 15 to 18 miles per hour in the rough terrain areas where there's Strstrugi fields. And so that's telling you that, like, when we're on the plateau and there's more smooth area, and there might even be, like I said, there's most likely there's even graded roads on the unclaimed land area of Antarctica, because that's what Colin O'Brady was navigating on. there's these graded roads all across Antarctica to the interior stations. So there could be a large portion of this plateau where it's just smooth, smooth sailing for a big part of the way. So they could easily be going 25 to 30 miles per hour for long stints at a time. So I just wanted to point that out, that even on the rough areas, they're still going nearly 20 miles per hour. So they're obviously going much faster in these large plateau areas. And he's navigating a lot of times 100 kilometers to 211 kilometers a day, which is very similar to what Mike Horn is navigating, but yet it took him like 32, 33 days longer to navigate. So again, doesn't really make any sense if they're navigating the same route. And I think that's where, again, the distances get distorted in the unclaimed land territory. But let's look at the Mike Horn distances here and just give you a general idea of how fast he's navigating and how the mileage and time frames do not add up. Now, just to kind of give you a relative idea of what speeds he's actually navigating, we can look at the professional kite skiers from these Ragnarok races in Norway that are navigating. If this is actually like it was a 2.5 or 3 hour time lapse. And for nearly 3 hours, he never drops below 20 miles per hour, like the whole race for 3 hours. And he actually gets up to almost 45 miles per hour several times. And you can look, he's, relatively, he's going the same speed as Mike Horn is on this plateau. So Mike Horn is navigating for 14 hours a day, traveling a minimum of like 20 miles per hour and upwards to 30 to 35 miles per hour for 14 hours a day. Now, when you take that into the overall length of his trip, now his trip was claimed to be 57 days long. Now, just to steel man this argument from like the globe perspective, we can look at what he actually really navigated, because there's 11 days when he was climbing the plateau. So obviously he's not going to be navigating that far over those 11 days. So that drops us down to about 46 days. And then if you go to his social media, there was, I think, 4 days where he rested and he bunkered down because the weather was too bad to navigate. This was per his Facebook and Instagram. So that takes us down to about 42 days. And then he had about, we'll say there was like 2 or 3 days where he only navigated 10 miles or less. So we'll just say 40 days of him actually navigating at 20 miles per hour. So if we take that at 14 hours a day times 20 miles per hour, that's 280 miles a day. And we can take that over the course of 40 days. That's 11,200 miles that he would be navigating, when the trip from Novo Station to across the edge of the other side of Antarctica to Dumont D'Urville is only 3,100 miles. So the math just is not adding up. And the reason why he's navigating, 4 or 5 times farther than he should be is because of these GPS meridian distance corrections that are baked into the GPS he was using with his Iridium satellite phone. And that's why when you figure this all out and you add up the total distance he's navigating at the end, he's coming out to an average speed of like 3 to 3.5 miles per hour, which is like walking speed, which would be impossible because he's kite skiing the entire time across Antarctica, traveling nearly 20 miles per hour for 14 hours a day. So the math just doesn't add up. So he's navigating much farther, like I said, almost, over 11,000 miles. So it just doesn't add up. And the reason for that is, again, because of these GPS meridian distance corrections. These are the same built-in GPS meridian distance corrections that I had referred to previously in several other videos that were cited in the physics paper, The GPS and the Constant Velocity of Light by physicist Paul Marmot, that was discovered by physicists and GPS engineers decades ago. Now, these GPS meridian distance corrections are built in between the meridian lines to correct for the longer distances below the equator and spherical excess below the equator. And this is why when they navigate all these extra miles, it's only showing that they're, navigating, 2 to 3 miles per hour when they should be navigating, 15 to 20 miles per hour over these long distances, because the GPS is automatically making these corrections in the GPS coordinate system on the ECI reference frame and the atomic clock. It's all built into the synchronization of the GPS coordinate system. So it's always going to correct for the distance that they should be navigating on a globe assumption, when in reality they're navigating much more greater distance, many more thousands of miles than what they're allegedly navigating. So it's all built into the GPS coordinate system, and that is why they're covering much greater distances when they're navigating on these Antarctica expeditions. Next, we're going to look a little bit more into the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition from 1955 to 1958. This actually, the route they took was from the Shackleton base to the South Ice, then to the South Pole, and then down to Scott's base. Vivian Fuchs actually started at Shackleton base and navigated to the South Pole, whereas Edmund Hillary was on the other side of Antarctica at Scott base, and then he met him at the South Pole, and then they went back down to Scott base together. Now, there was a few discrepancies I ran into with this, and a few suspicious coincidences with this expedition. One of the things I ran into was some of the time discrepancies. When we compare it to like newer, more recent expeditions that took a similar route. There's also some contrary information to the 24-hour sun in Antarctica that I came across in one of the documentaries. There's also a suspicious coincidence, very suspicious coincidence with the timing of the Antarctica Treaty and this being the first overland crossing of Antarctica. So there's quite a few suspicious coincidences and discrepancies I came across. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the actual route they took and what that looks like on a flat map. Again, we can kind of take a closer look at the Trans-Antarctic expedition map, the route that they took. And we can see here that they started, Vivian Fuchs started at Shackleton base and then navigated down to South Ice and then to the South Pole, and then Edmund Hillary navigated up onto the plateau and then navigated up through the South Pole where both teams met, and then they navigated back down together and finished at Scott base. Now we can take this same route and we can put that onto a flat map, and we can see here, Vivian Fuchs navigates to the South Pole, and then Edmund Hillary navigates down to the South Pole, and they both meet. Now again, he obviously travels through this unclaimed land territory, which I'm going to bring up again here. There's a suspicious timing with that. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but they both meet at the South Pole and they navigate back to Scott base. Now this was the first this is the first time in history that somebody had made a overland crossing of Antarctica, and we can look at the timing and date of it, the mileage. They finished in March 1958, and it took about 2,158 miles in about 99 days to make that expedition. Now, at first glance, that seems kind of like a long time to finish that when we look at all the other expeditions that have made a very similar route and have done it much faster and have covered much more land and many more miles quicker. But, we can look at, for example, Mike Horn. Now he traveled about 3,100 miles, so almost 1,000 miles further than this expedition. Started farther east and ended farther west on his expedition than this one did by 1,000 miles, and he still finished in 57 days. Almost half the time it took for that expedition. Now you could say, he was traveling with kite skis, so he was, moving at a pretty quick speed. And also, the Commonwealth expedition got stuck in, crevices a few times with their transportation equipment. But also Mike Horn, he had a few days where he couldn't navigate too. So you can kind of chalk that up as, they both ran into issues on their expeditions. But if, we want to look at, if we kind of want to steel man this argument, say, well, he's, kite skiing, he's traveling a lot faster speeds. Okay, well, we can look at Colin O'Brady. He did his expedition 932 miles in 54 days. He took a somewhat similar route. He actually, he didn't extend all the way down to Scott Base. He went to Leverett Glacier. So they traveled about 1,000 miles further. But if we take that same rate, he would have been traveling at about 17 miles a day. And at that same rate, he would have done the same. And again, Colin O'Brady, he didn't use any kites. He didn't use any mechanized equipment. It was all pure muscle power. So that's how he did his expedition. So at that same rate, he would have been traveling 17 miles on average a day. He would have finished this same expedition as the Commonwealth expedition in about 125 days walking. So he would have done that on foot. If he was following behind these guys just walking on foot, he would have done the same thing in about 120, just 25 days more. So I don't know. It doesn't prove anything necessarily, but it just seems really odd that somebody could walk that same route in just a little over 20 more days. It doesn't really seem to add up. And again, when we look at this here, that's when we notice a lot of the timing discrepancies with these other expeditions is the unclaimed land territory. Now, this expedition finished in 1958, and the Antarctica Treaty was signed into place by all the signatories the following year in 1959. So the year after the very first Antarctica crossing of the continent, pretty much immediately the following year sign a treaty that establishes this huge slice of area removed from Antarctica as unclaimed land that nobody can inhabit or own or possess or put Antarctica base stations. The very first year after somebody makes a historical crossing across Antarctica. I think that's pretty suspicious and coincidental timing that they remove an entire swath of area where there's literally thousands of miles where there's not a single base station or anything located in that area. So, and then ever since then, every other crossing and traverse expedition has always gone through this quote unquote unclaimed area that's missing thousands of miles of base station. If not several thousands of miles of base stations. So, and that's where you have all these discrepancies taking place. So, and there's, paved and graded roads that go through here. So it just seems very odd. I think there could be a lot of manipulation with the orientation and of these base stations and with McMurdo and Novo and the way they're laid out and with this unclaimed land area here. So then you throw in all the magnetic declination, the arbitrary locations of poles. There's just a lot of suspicious coincidences and timing with the Antarctica Treaty and the layout and geography of these base stations in the South Pole. So, but there was another thing. Some people will say, well, how did they both navigate to the South Pole and meet there without, and have GPS or anything like that? Well, the thing is they followed with Edmund Hillary. He actually followed the supply. He restocked these supply depots that were set by Shackleton from his first expedition to the South Pole, we can see all these depots are laid out at, every latitude. So they're just following these depots, these supply depots, and they actually followed them again on the way back out through Scott Base, to Scott Base. And we can see that these are all laid out at, pretty much every degree of latitude up to the South Pole. And then on the other end with Vivian Fuchs, they had a reconnaissance team. There's several articles stating that this reconnaissance team, they set up the South Ice Base, but they also set up supply, like they flagged out the route, they marked it out and flagged it out for him to follow to the South Pole. So both sides had a flagged route that they followed to the South Pole, and that's how they basically both met there. So that's just another misconception that a lot of people I don't think know about. But it was all planned. It was a planned route. It was a flagged route that they all knew exactly where they were going. So that's how they navigated to the South Pole. Now, another thing I wanted to mention that I came across with this documentary was a discrepancy with the, 24-hour sun. Now, there's a mention of when they overwintered the year before in the at the South Ice and set up the expedition for Vivian Fuchs. They had mentioned in the documentary that during that winter, there's 4 months of complete darkness. And then in the very next scene, it shows them coming out, and it's like complete daylight out, at South Ice during the winter in Antarctica. So now that's not, obviously, it's not the summer. It's not necessarily directly tied to the 24-hour sun, the summer solstice, but it's the opposite. It's, you'd have to have that opposite equivalent during the winter. You'd have to have the 4 months of nighttime, and it's showing complete daylight while they're wintering there. And I'm going to show you that clip here in just a minute.
The snow and facing into the prevailing wind. Outside, there will be 4 months of unbroken darkness, the Antarctic winter. Inside, life would go on as normally as we could make it. Our first rule was, when you come in, leave the outside behind. We'd built our home. Winter was not hibernation. Only the men on cook duty stayed indoors continuously for any length of time. We had to go out and get in cold. We'd organized ourselves for many things, but not running water. We needed daily 3 gallons a man. And to get that daily, we had to go out and cut it in blocks from the snow. Then there were the physiological tests, man hauling sledges of different weights to measure our work capacity.
Now, we can see from that clip that there was kind of some contrary evidence to what should be the 24-hour sun in Antarctica. Now, if you've seen at the beginning of that clip, he had mentioned that there would be 4 months of non-interrupted darkness in Antarctica during their winter. And then the very next clip, you see of them leaving the South Ice hut that's full daylight out for like days at a time during this winter when they're overwintering. So, again, it's not during the summer solstice when you'd see the 24-hour sun, but again, it's the opposite, their winter, when you'd have to have the opposite observation, where you'd have to have no sun for 4 months, and they're seeing sun, daylight during this winter when they're supposed to be wintering at the South Ice Station. So it's just another thing to add to the opposite observations at the North and South Pole not matching up at the same latitudes. So just kind of speculated on that and thought that was kind of odd. Another thing that didn't really work in Antarctica. But another thing you'll notice with these Antarctica expeditions is the routes that they take. They generally they all take the same east to west routes when they navigate. They take these from East Antarctica to West Antarctica, and they all kind of follow that same pattern when they're navigating. And you'll notice that they'll start at Novo Station or the Ronnie Ice Shelf, and they'll navigate the South Pole, and they'll come out at the Ross Ice Shelf, and they always go east or west to east. They go this way across Antarctica, but you'll never really see any of the expeditions go this way. You'll never see them go north to south and make a, pure longitudinal meridian journey across Antarctica. It's always the opposite, and that's 99% of them. They never go this way. And it's the same thing with flights. You'll never see any in the history of aviation. There's never been a single flight that has flown over north to south or Antarctica and then pop up over in Perth or Sydney, Australia. That's never been done in the history of aviation. And I did an extensive debunk video on that debunked all north to south flights. That shows that they never fly north to south over Antarctica. They just skim east to west over the small sliver of the coastline of Antarctica, and then they go to their destination. So why is it that no humans can ever really explore north to south, and no flights can ever go north to south of Antarctica? It's always west to east, and vice versa. It's just this, they go over to Antarctica this way. So now there is one that claimed to do that, and that was the 1989-1990 Trans-Antarctic expedition by Will Steger, which I'm going to cover that here shortly. But we're going to find what the time frames and the mileage discrepancies that most likely was not the case. They just skirted around the coastline back up to Murney Station at the end of the expedition. Once we went past the South Pole, and that's where you have all those time frame discrepancies. Once you go, beyond the South Pole, if you're trying to go a north to south expedition, you'll run into all these time frames discrepancies because Casey Station, Murney Station are all the way up here up north. So, and but another reason that they don't really make these north to south navigations is because when you look at the katabatic winds, they kind of they follow that same general path. At least in the case of Mike Horn, they followed the same route that he took. And even with these other west to east navigations, and that it gives them assistance when they're kite skiing, because it gives them the wind speed to kite ski. But when you look at this, the fact that Antarctica is allegedly a small continent at the bottom of a globe, these winds are going in all different directions, and it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense once you take a closer look at it. Now we can kind of compare the katabatic winds on the right here. We can kind of see how they're moving in all these different directions, and we can compare that to the information from the data from the Null School website that shows all the wind patterns, the current patterns, all this data. We can see that on a globe model on there, they got the winds going all different directions. It's a big pile of spaghetti. It's all over the place. But yet when you switch it over to an AE projection, it's all uniform and it all flows perfectly. The katabatic winds, the southern jet streams, the northern jet streams, the Antarctica circumpolar currents, which I'm going to show here in a little bit, they all flow in like a uniform direction. And even when you go into higher altitudes, the jet stream can go in opposite directions. So they go the opposite way, but they generally go all the same direction, the same airflow. But again, we look at the globe, and the winds are actually flowing with the rotation of the Earth, which doesn't make sense, because if the Earth is rotating this way, the winds would have to flow the opposite direction, but they're not. So it doesn't make any sense. And it just, with these winds going all different directions in Antarctica, but if you actually inverted this map onto a AE and you transferred it over to a AE coordinate system, these winds would all be flowing in that same direction instead of all the opposite directions. Even with the Antarctic circumpolar currents, you can see these heat spots. This would be where the sun goes around on the tropics. Everything lines up perfectly with the flows of the currents and everything. So it doesn't necessarily debunk anything. It's another thing that doesn't work in Antarctica, is these wind directions. But With that being said, let's go ahead and get into more details on this William Steger north to south expedition in Antarctica. Now we're going to look at the 1989-1990 International Trans-Antarctica Expedition. This was led by Minnesota native Will Steger, and this is the essentially the only expedition that is considered to have allegedly transversed Antarctica from north to south. And we're going to look at a lot of the discrepancies that I came across with this, and some what could seem like next to impossible logistical impossibilities. Um, there was also some very interesting, suspicious coincidences that I came across with this, with a couple of interviews that Will Steger had done, some brief interviews. Some things that he said in the interview were kind of suspicious in regards to what he had said about there no longer being sled dogs after his expedition. They made an amendment to the Antarctica Treaty during those expeditions, and also another interview, he kind of had stated that that expedition can never be done again, that particular route. And then there's also a Wikipedia article saying the same thing. And I believe the reason that this was said in an interview and in articles is it's kind of setting the narrative for why people can no longer take that north to south route, because it's just not logistically reasonable. And we're also going to look at the time frames of this doesn't really line up with the other time frames. It kind of takes a lot of the reason and rationale and sensibility and legitimacy out of these other Antarctica expeditions that went east to west. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and look at the map of this and take a closer look at this Antarctica expedition. So this was the map of the International Trans-Antarctica Expedition from 1989 to 1990. And we can see that on this expedition, they started up at the tip of the Antarctica Peninsula, and they navigated down to, I can't remember, I think it was King George Island. And from there, that's where they started. And then they traversed to the South Pole. They had a team of 6 guys, and I believe it was like 32 sled dogs. And they traversed with sled dogs down to the South Pole, and they were at the South Pole for, I believe, 3 days doing like presentations. And then they also met some of the Soviets, the Russians there, who did their own. They dropped like the supplies and fuel off there for them, and they did their own expedition to get there. It took them a couple months to get there and meet them there. And from there, they followed, after they left South Pole, they followed the Soviet, um, like their raid of vehicles, their transportation, like snowcats and everything. They kind of followed in the wake of them. So they had a much smoother path navigating from like these other stations, Vostok and um, these other interior Antarctica stations, Russian stations, and then finishing at Murney. Now, this expedition took 220 days, and it was an estimated 3,700 miles. Now, right off the bat, that seems like a long time. That's over 7 months to traverse from here to here. Whereas we have expeditions like with Mike Horn, for example, that navigated 3,100 miles, and he started from Novo Station and he went east to west and went to Dumont Deville. This only took him 57 days, so not even 2 months to cross this way. Um, and it took almost 7 months to cross from here to here. Now, that just seems like a huge gap in time. The time frame just seems way off. And again, it's because of where they're navigating. If we look at the map, we can see They would have went from the peninsula to the South Pole, and then they would have had to, their magnetic declination. It says they navigated with a sextant for most of the way, so they're obviously they're going to be following their compass is not going to work, so they're going to keep having to correct for magnetic declination, and that's going to take them. It's going to keep traveling them all the way around the coastline of Antarctica, and then until they get up back to Murney Station. Now, this may not necessarily be as far the extent that they went because, like I said, with how they arbitrarily place these base stations and orient them with the land masses and continents, they could have maybe just navigated up to here, and then I think it was the Rubidov Russian the ship that picked them up at Murney Station could have just taken them back to Russia, over here. So we don't know exactly if it was here, if it was here, but they would have had to skim that coastline with their navigation. And that's why it took them 7 months, 220 days, for something that was only 600 miles longer than the Mike Horn expedition that went east to west. So they spent over 5 months more extra navigating this small section here, as opposed to something that should have only taken another, month to a month and a half. It took them 5 months. And to me, that time discrepancy just doesn't add up. Now, when we look at this, there's also some other things I came across with this trip. We're going to look at one of the interviews he did, where he states that that route they took, they can never do again. Now, he says something along the lines of, some of the ice melted, so you can't take that exact route. But, he says that, basically, for the most part, nobody can really take that route that he took north to south ever again. And then there's even in this Wikipedia article, they make a statement here, kind of a weird statement, that no one has ever tried a polar crossing of such length. It is unlikely anyone will ever do it again. So it seems like with and he said this in several interviews too. There's like 3 or 4 interviews where he's like, no one will ever do this expedition again. You can't do it. And then there's the Wikipedia article. So it seems like with these interviews and these articles online about this route, they're kind of setting the narrative like, hey, you can't take this north to south route anymore. Nobody can ever do it again. And it's also interesting that after this expedition, the one and only north to south expedition that's ever happened in human exploration over Antarctica, they changed the whole Antarctica Treaty to where you can no longer navigate with sled dogs. So, it doesn't really necessarily prove anything. It's just suspicious, like do they not want you exploring more further into Antarctica than you should be? I don't know, but there's a lot of things that change with the treaty after this expedition. And it seems like the same thing happened with the first east to west crossing of the Commonwealth expedition in 1958. They changed the whole. They actually established the Antarctica Treaty then. So every time there's been the first crossing east to west and a alleged crossing north to south, they either established the Antarctica Treaty or they made modifications to it. So it's a lot of suspicious coincidences with Antarctica and the Antarctica Treaty. But let's go ahead and look at one of these interviews that he says, where he states makes a couple of statements that were a little bit suspicious and kind of draw more coincidences to this expedition.
Well, in other news this morning, it was 20 years ago that a team of 6 men from 6 different countries and their 42 sled dogs completed the first ever dog sled crossing of the Antarctic continent. The expedition was led by Minnesotan Will Steger. The group traveled nearly 4,000 miles in 7 months, and temperatures dropped as low as negative 54 degrees. But an expedition like this could not even happen today. Not only have dogs been banned from Antarctica, 2 of the ice shelves, which took nearly a month to cross, no longer exists. And on this anniversary weekend, Will Steger is here. Thank you so much for coming on. Yep. I do think it is remarkable that the anniversary of this great expedition happened, yesterday. Your thoughts on that?
Well, we had a public event, it was of course canceled, but we were all holed up in the embassy suites by the airport. The planes, of course, couldn't get out yet last night, so we were all together an extra day. So storms like this are pretty common to us. Actually, we call this a warm weather storm.
A warm weather storm. Well, we're talking about wind chills, below zero. You had temperatures minus 50. I mean, how is it possible to survive that month after month?
Well, we had actually 60 days of storms, and we had laid out our food caches the year before, and some of these food caches we couldn't find. So we were actually forced to travel in these storms. Wind chill is 110 below zero. So traveling in storms are pretty common to us. Being in a hotel during the storm was pretty nice pretty ironic, too.
Okay. One of the things, obviously, that people are focusing on is that you couldn't do this today because some of these shelves that you crossed,
yep.
Giant, huge areas of ice are no longer there.
Well, climate change is changing everything in the polar regions. In the Arctic, the Larsen A and B ice shelf, which you mentioned took about 30 days to cross, that is disintegrated. That's now open ocean. So the exact route we took, you couldn't take anymore because it's ocean instead of 1,000 feet of ice. And then they banned dogs in Antarctica in 1993, so you couldn't go back. So our expedition and the Amundsen, Norwegian, who first made the pole almost 100 years ago, we were the only dog sled expeditions to make it.
There's some great pictures there.
To my knowledge, people tend to be taking more or less the same path when they cross Antarctica. People are going this way, not something like, for example, this way. It appears that, in general, all so-called Antarctic expeditions take roughly this same path. They generally worked in this area, the path, and then over in this area, which would be perhaps the bulge, if the bulge theory is correct. If the continent theory is correct, such as the Jerusalem map involves, then if a different trajectory was taken and somebody ended up, for example, over here, they would be in a location that virtually and nearly no people have ever been to. They could be the first person setting foot on a certain geographical point on Earth. According to the academic and heliocentric mainstream ideas of Earth and history and science and so forth. Therefore, it is curious that basically the same path is taken by all people. Perhaps this is a path which has been informed to people is the best path to take, and so people follow along and naturally just take it. Otherwise, we are left to believe that virtually no people on Earth, except perhaps a few government officials here and there, can claim to have been in other parts of Antarctica, and therefore virtually nothing is known about it, such as if it is part of an ice wall or part of a continent which is not where it is believed to be on a globe planet, and is situated, for example, where it is placed in the Jerusalem map. I'm sure there are examples of people who have said they have taken very different trajectories than the common paths taken in the map you are seeing here. But the point is, we are talking about an astonishingly small amount of people, if any. There should be vast amounts of Antarctica, according to the standard idea of what Antarctica is, according to the heliocentric model, where literally nobody has ever walked. So astonishingly little is known about Antarctica. It could be very easily faked to be something quite different than what we're told it is by the professional academic, professional science view according to the globe of the heliocentric model. Things could be quite easily covered up due to the fact that such an astonishingly few amount of people have been into the interior in crossing Antarctica, and far, far fewer yet have been to the remotest locations, which is the bulk of the so-called continent that we're discussing here. It is difficult to say that Antarctica doesn't exist, and therefore that is not the position held by Zeteticism.com at the moment, given all the records of people seeing it and flying over it. However, it's a very small leap in logic to say that Antarctica is very different than what we're told it is, such as being in accord with the bulge theory or the continent theory according to the Jerusalem map, oriented in the way you are seeing on your screen now. One could travel to and from various places on the coast of Antarctica from the continents and the Earth plane and not have any idea that they're not traveling on a heliocentric ball. Here is an example of an expedition that purports to have gone a very different route, ending up somewhere in this region over here. They were purported to have been returned on a Soviet ship called the Professor Zubov, according to Wikipedia's 1990 International Trans-Antarctica Expedition entry. Notice in that entry right here it says, "No one has ever tried a polar crossing of such length. It is unlikely anyone ever will again." So as was just said a moment ago, virtually nothing is known about parts of Antarctica outside of this common paths region that we've been discussing. Apparently, if the Professor Zubov boat is a government boat, then the return of these people that made this expedition would be in the hands of government, and therefore would be back to the original problem, which is that governments are the ones, an astonishingly few amount of people in governments are the ones who know about these remote parts of Antarctica, and virtually no theoretical or empirical information of any sort exists from them outside of agencies such as NASA and other government agencies. So in summary, the idea of Antarctic expeditions is not in any way problematical for the zetetic model of Earth. And as with so many other things about our world, such as airline flight patterns, the strange oddities about NASA, the oddities about the Antarctic cruises and Arctic airline trips with Antarctica Airlines, the Antarctica sailboat race, all of these things have enormously strange qualities to them, which are unexpected. For example, the Antarctic boat race, only a few people have ever done it. Some of the same people do it every year, and they never get very close to Antarctica, as the GeoShifter YouTube channel has pointed out. These Antarctic expeditions also fit in the same pattern, which is that they have all kinds of curious aspects to them. Why the same path taken all the time? I'm sure, of course, there's some reason that people are going to give, such as people falling through the ice or mountains in the way and so forth. But as implied above, how do we know? There's virtually no information on the vast majority of Antarctica other than clandestine government agencies. But to get back to the point, the idea of Antarctic expeditions is in no way problematical for Zeteticism.
Sir Ranulph Fiennes, he goes by the name of Ran. One of the things he did was a 3-year trip to circumnavigate the Earth north-south. And are we dealing with some just regular guy? Or are we dealing with Sir Ranulph Twistleton Wexara Fiennes, the 3rd Baronet, OBE? He was in the British Army for 8 years. He inherited his father's baronetcy. He's also cousins to Queen Elizabeth. So you don't have to look too far to see what kind of guy we are dealing with here. And a recent Telegraph article tells us that Sir Ranulph was in court recently because he was accused by Natalie Harrison of faking injuries to make his expedition seem more risky and exciting. And Natalie, she actually got hurt the second time she fell into a crevice on purpose. And you see him here with a ladder. I don't know who's carrying that for him while he's on these little journeys. But, oh, by the way, since Harrison agreed to go along with the 2 fake stunts, she got 0. In fact, she was ordered to pay Sir Ranulph Fakes-A-Lot $50,000 to pay for his lawyer fees, because the judge actually said that it was her choice to go ahead and agree with his idea of faking accidents. He is, of course, a Freemason, a member of the Belvedere Lodge, number 503. Of course, it runs in the family. But now let's take a look at this 1979 to 1982 Trans-Globe Expedition, the North-South Pole Circumnavigation. Yeah, right.
No one has ever done that! No one has ever done that in the history of Dota!
So let's take a look if there's any discrepancies that might lead us to believe that maybe this is some, I don't know, horseshit. It looks like 52,000 miles, it says here, in total was covered during this trans-globe expedition. Again, north-south navigation, 25,000 mile circumference, yet 52,000 mile trip. And we can note that it says it was such a huge challenge, no one has ever repeated the route. So now let's look at the Guinness Book of Fakery. According to this, we've got 35,000 miles. Okay, well, that's a little different. And this is the Guinness Book of World Records page. This is the Transglobe ship that actually he used to travel up and down the globe, I guess. They also had an interesting apparatus here. This is the Transglobe expedition, the plane. So even though they're supposed to be doing surface navigation, who knows what they actually did. Let's see here. This is the actual homepage for Sir Ran, the expedition. Oh, now it's a 100,000 mile route.
You lie to me. You make an excuse.
So they've now jumped from 35 to 52 to 100,000 miles, all talking about the exact same trip.
After all that we've covered today with these Antarctica expeditions, from some of the old historic expeditions to some of the more recent modern day expeditions of Antarctica, we've learned a lot of how these Antarctica expeditions aren't exactly what we're told they are. We've discovered there's a lot of discrepancies with the time and the mileage and the duration of these expeditions not really matching up to other expeditions. We've learned that there's a lot of things they're not telling us about with graded, road paths and starting and ending points. And some of these expeditions are not, being completely transparent with how many miles they're logging. One of the expeditions, changed from 35,000 to 50,000 to 100,000 miles. And then one of the expeditions that, one of the only expeditions that's ever gone north to south took, 7 months, 220 days, whereas the other expeditions going, east to west, something that's only about 500 miles less in distance, are taking only 50 something days to traverse. So we've discovered there's just a lot of discrepancies that just do not add up. And then you look into all the other parts and aspects of Antarctica with these globe races, not being what they're told they are. They're, covering much longer, greater distances than what we're told. And they're not even getting anywhere close to Antarctica. And the fact that there's never been a flight, in aviation history that's never gone north to south in a pure longitudinal journey over Antarctica. It's never been done by even a plane, something that should be simple, that could be done in a matter of, 7 or 8 hours. It's never been done. You start to wonder, why is there all these different discrepancies and all of these different issues that don't seem to line up with a lot of these Antarctica expeditions. It seems like it would be something that would be pretty straightforward. Just cross it and, provide all of the information, your GPS coordinates, and everything would be kind of lining up to be the same as every other expedition, but it's just not the case. From the historic to the modern day expeditions, they're all drastically different, yet they all take very similar routes. So there's been a lot of different things we ran into that just do not make sense. And the thing is, we have no way of verifying any of this information ourselves. We can't independently go down to Antarctica and, verify these claims for ourselves, and even if we tried, there's so much issues with these locations, these arbitrary locations with magnetic declination and unclaimed land territory of thousands of miles and different poles, several different south poles, some of them, multiple geographical south poles, evidence showing that. there's so much stuff that they're not being transparent about with Antarctica, and it just makes you wonder why so much uh, mystery. Um, so until we can actually go down and verify any of this for ourselves, which the Antarctica Treaty won't allow, we will never actually be able to know for certain what the true nature and geography of Antarctica truly is. And until then, Antarctica will remain a mystery and one of the world's most fascinating wonders.